From the Child Mind Institute. He's the Senior Director of Learning and Development. Like CHC, the Child Mind Institute is a nonprofit helping students and youth with mental health challenges and learning differences. Dr. Cruger specializes in neuropsychological evaluations, which you're going to hear more about today, cognitive assessments, and other various types of evaluations. Along with his work at the Child Mind Institute, he has supported programs and developed programs helping kids with challenges transition to college. He's developed evidence-based interventions to support the development of organizational skills in youth, and he has taught graduate and undergraduate courses as well. So earlier I had a chance just to check in with Dr. Cruger, and I said, what are you most proud of in your work? Because he's got obviously a long, extensive career. And he said, very simply but very profoundly, that he's most proud of helping kids get to a better place. And I think that's what we're all here to do in this big event today. So I was really just overjoyed to hear him make those comments. So let's please welcome Dr. Matthew Cruger.
Great. Thanks, Jody. Thanks for the presentation. I've got a few pieces of equipment here, so I'll sort of juggle them while I'm talking. I have a lot of information to present, so I want to be thoughtful that you'll want to personalize that information and have questions. Sometimes it's best to wait a little while until the end, and I'll make sure that I set aside time to ask questions. But if I'm saying something that's not clear or really needs a point of clarification, hopefully you will let me know that so that I can kind of address that point. I really want to talk about neuropsychological and educational evaluation, sort of give you an inside perspective on them. I have a plan of talking about sort of trying to demystify and help you decipher what's involved in an evaluation. So I want to go through sort of the purpose of evaluations, how to think about eligibility and school services, talk about the types of evaluations you can get, the different kind of pieces or components of an evaluation, go through the process, and then think about resources that we could have available for you. Sometimes it's nice to start with an anecdote, to think about a situation. So this is a child that I had the pleasure of evaluating, and I thought my goal was sort of trying to get behind the behavior that was being seen and get a better understanding of what's going on. So teachers reported that this student, Fred, they said in math, Fred was described as a boy who has the ability to be a good student, but lacks focus and effort on his part. Lack of focus and effort on his part prevent him. He rarely takes notes, and during independent work, it takes him longer to complete the problems in comparison to others. It's not a matter of the work being difficult, but rather there's just no motivation on Fred's part. His science teacher stated, he has shown himself to be a very capable student. When he has chosen to be on task. Fred typically has done very well on tests. However, Fred sometimes has chosen to not be on task and has engaged in off-task behaviors at opportune moments. I think that it's off-task behaviors at inopportune moments, like he's engaging in those behaviors at the wrong time. But anyway, teachers also reported in replacement language arts. So this is really a special education language class. Okay, so providing a teacher who knows that he needs more support in language arts said, Fred has a good grasp of concepts presented in class. At times he displays good sentence and paragraph structure, correct use of punctuation and creativity. Sorry, that should say Fred. Fred has the ability to be a capable writer, but he does not always display the proper motivation and work ethic to do so. Unfortunately, Fred needs to be refocused to task often. He often engages in attention-seeking behavior by calling out, asking off-topic comments, or distracting other students. Okay? When reading, Fred will not properly sound out words, but it's difficult to decide whether this is a reading problem because he will laugh while it's happening and further distract fellow classmates. His reading tone will be in a whisper and inaudible to the rest of the class. Fred has a good reading comprehension but does not display this ability unless it's a graded assignment. So sort of what thoughts do people have from that? When you hear those teachers say that, what do you think they're thinking? What do you think is going on for Fred? Do you have any guesses? Does it sound familiar? Yeah, these are the kind of comments that I often read. I read them and I think to myself, it sounds pretty clear that the teachers are noticing problems with motivation and behavior, right? They're citing that they think focus is the main issue. This last teacher, though, sort of says something interesting as she starts to talk about that he's got a problem with sounding out words, though as she's noting that he's struggling with sounding out words, she's also highlighting it seems like it's a motivational issue in some way. So they're making some decisions about the observations that they have. I always like to get good observations from teachers. They're central to understanding what's going on with a child, but also sometimes people interpret the observations that they have and try to make sense of them and prioritize them. I think that's partly what I'm supposed to do in the evaluation process, but in this case, it seems like it's sort of cast aside, this problem with reading comprehension. You think there's any bias in that? I'm not sure, but I might think so. It's sort of like, that's why I'd rather do something very controlled to try to make sense of what's going on, and that's how I see the evaluation. For Fred, he was evaluated when in 2001. I saw him probably 2010. This is as he was entering into high school that I heard these things. There was a diagnosis that was given at the time he was first evaluated of ADHD. So the school district had him classified as other health impaired, which is sort of a catch-all category for kids who have attention problems. But in this context, he wasn't identified as having any learning disabilities, even though he was provided some special education support. The evaluation that I did indicated that he actually had a pretty prominent learning disability. His reading comprehension was at the 50th percentile, but his reading speed, the accuracy of his decoding, the fluency of his reading was more like at the 2nd percentile compared to other kids his age. So he was a reasonably intelligent boy, but he really was struggling profoundly to sound out words. That was sort of getting glossed over by the fact that they were seeing sort of problems with attention. He did have attentional ADHD, but the attentional problems were mild. The reading comprehension, the reading difficulties were really the thing that was impacting him the most. You couldn't detect that by observation. You really needed an evaluation to help make sense of that. So this was sort of my effort to sort of clear up the picture and get what was behind the behavior. So for me, the purpose of evaluations is really to show that we're doing a strengths assessment and looking at the needs that a child has and using that as a foundation for success, right? Oftentimes when I'm done with an evaluation, one of the most important things is not that the child has some weaknesses, but what strengths they have. I want to highlight if a child has average intelligence, that means you can do anything you want to do with your intelligence, right? You perform just the way that people are supposed to perform. So I want to highlight what are those strengths. I want to make sure that my evaluations at the end of them result with a roadmap, a guideline of what steps are supposed to happen to sort of make things be possible. Sometimes it's helpful for younger kids or even for the child the first time I see them to establish what the baseline is. How are they functioning now? Because I want to make suggestions about how to help them function better. And so if I can come up with a good game plan, a good roadmap for how to help them perform better, then I'm going to be able to judge how they're performing over time and see that they've improved from that baseline. I want to provide a profile of student skills and so that teachers and clinicians can use that to inform the parents, help you guys understand what it is that's going on with a child, and also, you know, an evaluation and the findings from the evaluation are really essential for figuring out what services a child is eligible for. Evaluation should help parents and schools address schools. So parents often question a child's academic achievement. They see the child struggling with homework. They see the problems with disorganization. So we need an answer for why those problems are happening. Teachers notice specific weaknesses sometimes, and that might be the reason why an evaluation is suggested. So oftentimes, it's very easy, I think, for parents, myself as a parent included, when a teacher gives us feedback about something they're seeing, it doesn't feel very good to hear if we're hearing about something that's problematic. But, you know, in many ways, we want the teacher's input so that we can help determine what's going on and how to help a child perform better. Learning specialists or school psychologists might also be people who are involved in suggesting that an evaluation would be helpful. Sometimes they're already involved with the family. You have a reading tutor working with your child, so they might have some perspective on what's going on, or there's someone who's really noticing that the child's not doing well. The most common concerns for me are often academic concerns, right? That something is really getting in the way of a child's performance in their job. School is their job. And so I would even highlight that, let's say that the problem is not that they're performing poorly academically, but they're not really seeming to be interested or satisfied in learning. That's a problem, right? A child is supposed to really enjoy going to school and like the things that school has to teach them. So if they're not happy about school, not finding school interesting, that's something that is a source of concern. I don't know what that means, but I sure want to clarify that because I want them to have a good experience when they go to school. There are many times where we're going to look at other aspects of functioning, like the motor functioning. How well is a child able to use their body to do things? How well can they use a pencil to write, or manage the space in a classroom, or in the gym class? We want to look at speech and language issues. We want to think about social aspects of functioning and communication. We certainly care about behavior. Behavior is probably the #1 reason that I might see a kid early on, because they've engaged in some disruptive behavior in the classroom that the teachers are struggling to manage, and that's causing them some difficulty. Again, like with Fred, the behavior in and of itself doesn't tell me a lot about what's going on diagnostically, right? So I need to kind of clarify what's behind the behavior. And I certainly think parents hear about and are concerned about inattention, right? If you're having a hard time focusing, that doesn't mean you can't learn to read, but it's really going to impact your capacity to perform well in school. In general, evaluations are going to measure a child's academic achievement, highlight a child's learning strengths and weaknesses, and help determine eligibility for services. That might be from public agencies, in public school, from private schools, from private agencies. Sort of depends on who is going to provide the services that the child needs in order to function better, but where it's going to help, the evaluation should help provide us a guideline for that. Eligibility for school services really comes from the Individuals with Disabilities Act. So it's a federal mandate for special education. We need to have a diagnosis of it for the child in order to, or there has to be a disability for the child to be eligible to receive services. But the key principles involve FAPE, this idea that all children should have free and appropriate access to public education. Okay, so anything that seems to interfere with that, the capacity for them to get the proper kind of education that they need, we want to figure out how to address that and provide them something that is going to work for them. Money cannot be a factor determining what decisions are appropriate for your child, right? We can't say they're entitled to FAPE, but it costs too much to give them the program that they want. That is explicitly not allowed. We want to think about least restrictive environment. This is a term that you might hear when your child is coming for special education services, where people are telling you that's probably not an environment for your child to be in because it's too restrictive. I'll definitely have thoughts about that. You might not agree with what someone says, that this environment's not the proper choice because it's too restrictive, but least restrictive environment means they're in the sort of the most appropriate setting for their capacities, and they're not supposed to be in an environment that's too, that sort of disallows them to do things that they're capable of doing. The Individuals with Disability Act also sets up for the possibility of getting an individual education plan, so a specialized plan for your child if they're found eligible to receive special education services would highlight what are the things that they need and really should cover all of their areas of functioning. An evaluation, anyone can be referred if there's a concern, right? If you are concerned, then we want to help you figure out how to get an evaluation done. States must provide early intervention developmental services for children diagnosed under the age of 3. Public school districts must provide appropriate educational services for children aged 3 to 21. And an IEP could be eligible, each child is eligible to have an IEP if they meet the criteria of needing special education services. Some of the categories that are included, these vary sometimes from state to state, but this is a way to say not what the child's diagnosis is. That's what a clinician will do. A school district's not trying to determine, does your child meet criteria for a diagnosis? They're trying to figure out what category should we use to define what your child's needs are and why they're eligible for special education services. Because if we put them in certain classifications or categories, then we'll know there are certain services that should go along with those things. So autism could be one, blindness, deafness, emotional disturbance could be a category where really the main concerns have to do with emotional reactivity, or potentially some behavior problems. If there's hearing problems, then that could be a category. Intellectual disability, being multiply disabled, having orthopedic disabilities, other health impairments. Learning disabilities is typically a category, speech and language impairments, traumatic brain injury, or other visual impairments. So there's a set of categories. Each state might differ in terms of which one of these categories would fit for a child, but they're trying to describe how to think about what are the services that should be provided. An IEP should be a written plan customized to each child's needs, and it needs to be implemented by the school district. Eligibility is really based on the results of an evaluation and on assessments. School evaluations are typically required every 3 years. The degree to which I don't know what any of your individual school districts do. There can be quite a wide variety, though, of the evaluations that are provided by the school district. I'll talk about what they're required to do, but how they actually implement that could vary from district to district. But they really have to, the IEP has to address the sectors of need. In terms of types of evaluation, common assessments by name that you might hear about, measures of intellectual or cognitive functioning like the WISC, the WIPSI, the WACE, the Stanford-Binet, the Woodcock-Johnson, the DAS. These are just acronyms that you don't really probably want to know about, but you'll end up seeing in documentation where an evaluation has been done. And school districts might say, or you might say to the school district, well, I need to make sure that you did these kinds of tests that are the standard tests we're using. These are not informal observations. These are measures that are given to a child and typically given in an individualized format. Okay, other types of educational measures include the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, the Peabody, the Woodcock-Johnson Achievement Tests. They're sometimes single subject tests that help clarify things that the larger comprehensive measures don't clarify, like the Gray Oral Reading Test, or a test of phonological awareness, that's the CTOP, a written language test, specific math tests. And often we're looking at a child's sort of social emotional functioning, maybe through checklist measures, but lots of school districts also do some sort of open-ended measures of emotional functioning, like the child's apperception test, or draw a person test, or a TAT, those kind of measures. In terms of a neuropsychological evaluation, I should highlight first, school districts are going to be, when they're doing an evaluation for your child, they're going to give a measure of intellectual functioning, they're going to give a measure of academic achievement, and they're going to give measures that look at social and emotional functioning. Okay, that's what they're required to do when they do an evaluation. So you want to make sure you have a sense of how intelligent is the child, what are they capable of doing, how does that compare to what they're doing academically, and what are the social emotional issues. In terms of neuropsychological evaluation, we're going to actually do those same tests, so we want to make sure we cover those issues too. It's really hard to know how a child's performing if you don't know what their level of intelligence is, because we would assume that a child who's performing below average might be struggling in other subject areas, or a child who's performing above average intellectually should sort of be capable of doing many things that are being presented in a classroom. But we'll add language functioning. We'll also give measures that look at attention and concentration. A set of skills we talk about is executive functions. We'll look at sensory motor or tactile perception and fine motor coordination. We'll look at visual spatial aspects of functioning. We'll look at learning and memory capacity. So we'll add those other components to it. Fred's an interesting example because he's a boy who was identified as having some attentional problems, but the evaluation that was done within a school district did not identify that the academic achievement was the main problem. Okay, so that's a sort of not always a typical measure, but sometimes or a typical profile we might see, but sometimes we see that a school district has done measures of intellectual functioning, academic achievement, and social emotional functioning, and then they concluded that the child's performing adequately in those domains, and so there's no reason to provide services. When you think to yourself, well, they seem to have a hard time with language, they seem to really struggle with how to really communicate their ideas and express their thoughts. So you might ask the school district, you know, that's the main concern that we have. We know he's performing adequately in terms of his reading, but we see his language as being disrupted. Could you do a speech and language evaluation? So they might add that on, because the school district is typically going to have a speech and language person who could do that sort of assessment. You might also say, you know, we know he's sort of doing fine in that, but he's a first grader, he's not really able to write, or let's say he's a third grader. His writing is really hard to read, he can't use his scissors, he can't really manage the classroom and move around in the classroom adequately, he stands too close to his peers, and so you might say, you know, we have concerns really about his motor functioning or his visual spatial functioning. Could you do an occupational therapy evaluation? And a school district might ask someone who's on staff there to add that component to try to take another piece of this. But it's hard for other professionals besides neuropsychologists to do an evaluation of attention and concentration, or evaluations of executive functioning, or evaluations of learning and memory. It is sort of the specialized domain of neuropsychologists, where we're adding things that are clearly pretty important to a child's cognitive functioning or classroom functioning to try to make sense of the whole picture here. So psychoeducational evaluation, I don't want to sound like because I end up doing neuropsych evaluations, I'm saying anything wrong with them. we very much know that a profile of performance on tests of intelligence and academic achievement might help us detect kids who need services. The most typical thing we'll see is kids who have a learning disability in terms of mathematics, or in terms of reading, or in terms of writing. If you just give tests of intelligence and academic achievement, you should be able to detect those weaknesses. We know what a profile for dyslexia looks like. So those are the measures that we use to try to figure that out. Sometimes we see school districts who've done an evaluation. I would look at the evaluation and say, this is dyslexia, and the school district is saying, we don't know what this is. So it could be because the school district or the professionals who are doing it are not sort of properly trained in how to understand the results of the test they're collecting, but we see a very specific profile of weaknesses in kids who have dyslexia, and we know how to detect it on measures of intelligence and academic achievement. So I'm not saying anything negative about anybody. They're very good evaluations, and they're very good evaluations as a starting point, right? So if you're concerned about your child, the school district doing evaluation is often a very fine place to start, because they're going to give measures and they're going to help us detect a group of kids that need supports and services. But the school district will also want to get a review of developmental history, so they want to sit down with you and ask you questions about social and emotional, or about the child's development, about their educational history, about their early upbringing. They should do a classroom observation, so they could go into the classroom to see what's going on. Let's say that a child is being bullied in class. Their behavior, if they're bullied, if they're a victim of bullying, is probably going to be erratic. They're going to be anxious and uncomfortable. They're going to be worried. They're going to feel threatened. So if someone goes in and sees that that's happening in the classroom, that might be the starting point. Maybe the child is not really experiencing any disruption in their academic capacity, but they're being threatened in the classroom, and so they're naturally acting in ways that are erratic. So we want to make sure a good observation gives us some information. There's also behaviors that we might see that would be meaningful to see in a classroom. So you might see then that a child is struggling with reading, or that a child, when it's their turn to go to read out loud, that they look and they see, oh, someone's coming. It's coming to be my turn. Let me get up. I got to go to the bathroom. Or then I'm going to have like a little fit or something like that that's going to throw that off track, because they don't want to be humiliated in the classroom by being asked to read when they know they can't do it well. So sometimes the observation could be very helpful in seeing what's going on. And as I mentioned, we're going to expect to see some educational evaluation. This is another indication just of what I said before, that actually psychological evaluations or psychoeducational evaluations include academic achievement, the classroom observation, the history, intellectual testing, and sometimes we might add these other components of language and occupational therapy, because they're really central to thinking about what a child needs. In terms of neuropsychology, we're going to add attention measures. We're going to look more closely at social emotional functioning, and we're going to look at interpersonal skills, so modes of pragmatic aspects of communication. We'll look at behavior, both internalizing behavior or externalizing behavior. The kids who are prone to internalizing behavior are the kids that are anxious and moody and sad. The externalizers are the kids who act out in classroom, so they might end up being more provocative or more oppositional. This is just a list of what we're thinking about when we're doing a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation. Sometimes I'm doing testing that's adding on to what the school district has already done, so I'm just filling out the other areas that haven't been addressed. But sometimes I'm just looking at the child from a whole perspective and giving them all of the tests and measures that are included here. In terms of cognitive and intellectual functioning, this is really going to view overall reasoning capacity and potential. It serves as a basis for comparison with other scores. There's a model of learning disabilities that's probably not the model that we use all the time now, but a discrepancy model, meaning if your child's performing in an average range on tests of intelligence, they should be performing in the average range on tests of reading. If they're not performing in that range, that suggests something is disrupted or something is wrong. We'd have to rule out that instruction is not the problem, right? Maybe we have to make sure they're getting adequate instruction in how to learn to read. But if they're underperforming in a significant way, that discrepancy tells us something about their area of weakness. So we use the IQ test as a standard for that. We also see variability in how children perform on IQ tests, so sometimes that could highlight things. Because the IQ test is really a set of cognitive measures, but it looks at verbal capacity, the knowledge base, reasoning capacity, visual analysis and reasoning capacity. It looks at attentional control and looks at the speed with which a child works. So sometimes we see variability in how they perform on some of those aspects. So the overall IQ score is not as helpful, because if a child's performing above average in verbal areas, but they're performing very poorly on tests like putting blocks together to make designs, we might interpret something about what their learning profile is like, that they'll struggle with some aspects of functioning in a classroom, not as much the conversation, not as much the linguistic give and take. In terms of language functioning, I should highlight, this slide probably needs a couple more things as I looked at it. Language functioning really starts in your child hearing the sounds and words before they actually go to school, right? So at home, you are talking baby talk to your child, but you're exposing them even before they're talking to a huge volume of words. And that's what they end up using to learn how to speak. So hearing the sounds and words is really the first component to language development. Kids build upon that sort of phonological awareness, hearing the phonemes in words, to understand words, to know how to sound them out, to know how to articulate them. We like those ways that little kids mispronounce words like aminal instead of animal, but it's showing that they're really working to get mastery over how the sounds and words go together to form full words, and then full words to full sentences and utterances and communication. The phonological weaknesses are one of the key things that we expect to see when we see children, most children who have dyslexia, one form of a reading disorder. That early on, they had a struggle with mastering the sounds and words. They couldn't rhyme as easily as another kid. They couldn't, and then when they got to individual reading instruction in class or group reading instruction, they couldn't do that as well either. So they were struggling to sound out the words and know how to manipulate them in favor of reading. So sometimes we have to do an evaluation that includes a component of language assessment, even if we don't think the child has problems with receptive and expressive language skills. But that's on that level of phonological processing. Lots of kids we also see might have some struggles with receptive and expressive language. Language skills are hard to assess sometimes because most of us give the benefit of the doubt to the people that we're listening to. So if someone is talking to us and they're not making a lot of sense, as a listener, we try really hard to figure out what they're meaning. So we fill in the gaps, or we try to draw out their meaning as we're trying to understand them. So sometimes kids might have mild forms of language problems, but because everyone's sort of trying to do their best to accommodate them, it's a little hard for the language weaknesses to be evident. But when we think about receptive language, we want to think about how well do they understand concept words, how well can they follow directions, do they have a good vocabulary, do they understand the syntax of common speech and language, and then do understand sort of the meaning of words. And so kids could have weaknesses on any of these areas, though they might perform well in some of the areas, they might perform weakly in one of these areas, and that might be the cause for their problems. So, I saw a kid whose main problems were on the meaning, drawing meaning from the information that he heard. So he could follow directions sort of okay, but he had a good vocabulary, but when you ask him to associate words that belong together in the same category, if I said to him, brush, soap, comb, and broom, I'd say, which two words go together? I want him to pick brush and comb because they belong to the same category, and he says brush and soap. Maybe there are things in the bathroom, but it seems much more obvious that a brush and comb go together. So sometimes kids might perform well in one area, but if you have a hard time with that sort of classification or understanding meaning, that's going to get in your way in learning some concepts in school. Expressive language. Most times if a child is having receptive language problems, they're probably going to see some disruptions in their expressive language, right? What you hear helps you figure out what you want to say. But if you're performing well in receptive language, it still means you could have some problems in expressive language because it's hard to articulate some of your thoughts or get them organized or put your ideas forth, to know how to sequence things, or to know how to use language pragmatically, right? Like, how do you interrupt a conversation with friends to tell them what you want to do? So some kids who have some social functioning problems end up having problems with pragmatic language. So it's important to sort of assess those different areas. In terms of academic functioning for all of these areas, reading, writing, and math, we want to think about two components, a sort of mechanical level of functioning and then an application level of functioning. So the mechanical level of functioning for reading is we want kids to know how to sound out words. We want them to be able to recognize words by sight. We want to look at their speed and fluency when they're reading. So kids who are reading and they're sort of burping out their words as they're reading, when they get to about, let's say, second or third grade, when there's not real fluency in how they're reading or a melody to how they're reading, then they're probably struggling with some aspects of how they're decoding. That sort of painstaking process of sounding out words for an older kid is typically a hallmark of some problems with reading decoding. The kids who have reading decoding problems in the group of kids who are described as having a reading disorder are kids who have dyslexia. That's the profile of dyslexia. That problems with sounding out words or quickly retrieving word labels has led to a problem with that level, that mechanical level of reading, though their comprehension might be intact. There are kids who might read a passage that another kid in their class might read in 1 minute. They might take 6 minutes to read it, and you're listening to them and you realize they're not sounding out a lot of the words very well. I can't imagine that they're going to understand it, but then you ask them questions about it, and they've sort of figured it out. So it's sort of amazing, but they might not have comprehension problems where they do actually have these sort of decoding weaknesses. Some kids may have problems in decoding and problems with comprehension, so that they might just struggle with decoding, and when they have to try to understand what's being communicated, they just can't answer questions about it. Some questions might look at literal responses, things that are directly stated in the text, so some kids will look back and figure out what the answer is, but some kids will struggle to do that, and then some kids perform well on those sort of straightforward fact-based questions from passages, but struggle with drawing inferences. So they can't make the assumption. If you said, what would be a good title for this story that you just read? They kind of can't figure out how to draw the inference of what the story was really all about. That might be a signal that there's some language problems as well, because comprehension involves the integration of sort of language with the decoding process. But we want to look at all of those levels. If a school evaluation only assessed decoding but didn't look at comprehension, or only examined comprehension but didn't look at decoding, we would be concerned, because that wouldn't be, you can think of examples, many examples, where that wouldn't be a fair way to assess a child's capacity. Just because they seem to answer the questions correctly doesn't mean that they're reading fluently. In terms of writing, there's lots of components of writing. I should say one more thing about reading. We have probably the most effective research literature that suggests we know what brain areas are involved in this pattern of not all reading disorders, but developmental dyslexia. That problem with sounding out words and reading fluently and then comprehending. We know what brain areas are involved in that. There's some disruption in the way those brain circuits have developed that's led to the problem with reading disorders, dyslexia in particular, so we know what that profile looks like. We know how to detect this. So again, maybe I'm beating a drum, but this condition should be easy to detect by an evaluation that looks at intellectual functioning, academic achievement, and if you see this pattern of performance of weaknesses in decoding, not weaknesses in comprehension, and adequate intellectual functioning, that's a signal that dyslexia is afoot, and the school district should be able to identify that as a specific learning disability that requires some instruction. I also say that because we have good models for how to intervene to help minimize the disruption from reading disorders. So we want to get those services to kids who have those problems early on. We want to provide enough of those services so that we can counteract the struggles that they're having. And so to think about kids who maybe are being identified for the first time with dyslexia in 7th or 8th grade feels really horrible to me. They should be able to be identified much earlier. So we should be able to get to this quickly. Yeah?
Can you address the appropriate assessments that should be used? Because I know sometimes the districts aren't quite catching it. And I'm wondering, and I'm thinking there's a missing phonological piece to their assessment.
It could be, yeah. So the examples from before on those slides that had to do with educational evaluation, some of those comprehensive batteries or single batteries typically are good enough to detect these problems, because the comprehensive batteries like the Kaufman or the Wyatt or the Woodcock-Johnson, they are looking at decoding. And they are looking at comprehension, and they're looking at multiple aspects of decoding. So they look at decoding by saying, sound out, read these words that are common words. So kids at a certain grade should be reading enough of those common words to perform well on the measure. They ask them, let's say you have a kid who's memorized lots of sight words but can't sound out any unfamiliar words. Well, they give them a test that looks at nonsense word reading. So they have to sound out these nonsense words according to the rules that they've learned about proper decoding. And if they can't perform well on that test, that would be a signal. They may need to add phonological measures to look at playing around and manipulating sounds in words. So we ask them to say popcorn. Okay, say popcorn. Now say popcorn without saying corn. So they should be able to manipulate that and isolate that. And it gets more complicated because on the phoneme level we say pig. Okay, now say pig, but don't say g. So they should say pi.
So is that part of Rupert Johnson and Elizabeth Wyatt?
Not directly. So sometimes they have to add a measure of phonology.
So how would you ask that? What specific assessment?
I would write them a letter or say in your IEP meeting, do you think a measure of phonological processing and rapid word retrieval would be helpful here? And they'll say, well, we don't really know. Or they might say, Eureka, you figured it out. It really depends. School districts are financially often trying to do the best that they can, but some of these issues come up. It might be that the educational evaluator, the person who's completed the educational test, is not allowed in that district to give measures of phonology because the speech and language people are the people who have to give those measures. Don't ask me why that's the case, but you might say, even if it's part of a speech and language evaluation, don't we think we should need that because I still see him as struggling with sounding out words? Yeah, you have every right to ask for what you think your child needs. And you have every right to say, try to insist, and every right to say, no, that's not good enough. Don't accept no for an answer, I guess, is the motto. Ask nicely, because if you don't ask nicely, then no one will listen to you. But you try to be insistent. There's an educational lawyer that we work with, and he had a conversation with parents, and he said, don't accept no for an answer. And he was like, he's huge, and he's like steely. You're like, the way I suggest that sounds very different than the way you suggest that. You have to suggest it the way that fits right for you. But you're trying to form an alliance with the school district to help them evaluate your child properly. So if you start with it, we're all in this together, let's try to work this out. It's probably a good starting point. And when they say no, then contact my lawyer. Okay. So components of writing involve many different things, but certainly we want to look at handwriting. Handwriting is going to become less and less important of a thing, right? We're not really teaching handwriting in school, but we want to still examine that. That could be a signal of some problems with fine motor control that are inhibiting a child's performance. Kids who struggle with handwriting complain that their hand hurts when they're writing. There's no psychological evidence for that, but I've heard it from so many kids who have fine motor problems that their hand hurts when they're writing that I believe it. Could be that the way they're holding the pencil is awkward. Could be that just it's a taxing experience for them to coordinate the motor movements of their hands so they feel sort of worn out or fatigued by the process of writing. There's no doubt if your handwriting is bad, you're probably going to produce less effective writing, minimal output. These produce short sentences when they could produce longer sentences if you talk to them about things. We want to look at the components of writing good sentences, writing good paragraphs. We also have some pretty good interventions for writing when writing is a problem, but writing is not specialized to one brain area or two brain areas like dyslexia is, so we don't have a good sort of model for it, but we know it comes from some aspects of language processing, attention, organization, integration of fine motor skills, but we want to look at also how they organize their writing as well. Some kids who have attention problems end up struggling on the level of application of writing where they have poor organization of their ideas and content and minimal output, though they don't really have a writing disorder. Sometimes when you see writing problems, you just look at it and you're like, this writing is not communicating effectively. Yeah.
You were talking about decoding and comprehension.
Yeah.
Like how that makes a big part in like how it writes. I mean, there's reading, there's writing, but like I'm learning Braille,
Yeah.
Because like you enter 3 keys with each hand,
Yeah.
as opposed to using your finger to make each letter.
Yeah.
It's just a system of symbols, a system of code. It's different and it works a lot better. And I'm learning it.
Oh wow.
It's very hard, but but there's no writing involved, because writing is very difficult, but I have a lot I want to say.
Yeah.
But I can't piece it all together.
Right. I mean, it's a nice point. I think that a lot of the people that I see who have writing problems struggle with some aspect of sort of integrating all of the things that writing involves. It's for sure the case that if you have problems with decoding words, the chances are much higher that you're going to have problems with spelling. The chances are much higher that you're going to also have problems if you have retrieval problems that are typical of learning disorders with retrieving when you're writing the proper grammar, the proper punctuation, the rules of grammar, how to integrate contextual conventions like quotation marks when there's someone who says something, or offsetting quotation marks with a comma. All those rules are, complicated. So problems with integration can lead to problems with writing, and certainly if you have a reading problem, your chances are higher that you might also have a writing problem. But your example is an interesting one. The goal in your case and in all of our cases is increase the likelihood that the child could get the output that we want to see them get, right? So a lot of times the guys who I see who have writing problems, it's like they got a lot to say. They could talk a blue streak if you give them the opportunity. So sometimes recording things might be a helpful way to do it, or talk to script. I think our technologies are going to help us in this domain. I know a lot of people want to ask questions. I just want to move through a little bit more so I don't divert us all the way, and then I'll give time at the end, if that's all right. Okay. In terms of writing, you can just see this list. These are all those skills that we're talking about trying to integrate. So writing is so multifaceted and so complicated. In terms of mathematics, you can think about the basic math facts or calculations as being sort of the level of mechanical skills, whereas word problems really require the application of thinking to how to make sense of problems. Some school districts have turned this on its head as they've thought talking with kids about mathematics is going to be a helpful way, and teaching them to think abstractly about number lines and ideas like that is a helpful way to teach them, and that the calculations will come. I'm not opposed to that idea. I just think some kids also need just basic numeracy teaching. They need to know these are how you learn the facts, and the kids who have problems mastering math facts probably have some learning disability in some way. If it takes them that much longer to master addition, subtraction facts, or times tables, then they're going to be headed for some troubles in a higher level math application. When we look at sensory motor functioning, we're looking at motor responses, fine and gross motor movements, integrating things. We're looking at judging line orientation, directionality, or visual construction, putting things together, copying information. So kids who might struggle in this are not going to have notebooks that have lots of notes in them. If there's a diagram on the board, they can't reproduce it in their book. They need some adjustment or accommodation. What makes the most sense? Get copies of the thing that is on the blackboard and have them given to them. For some reason, sometimes school districts still say, we can't do that. I don't know why. I don't understand that. The child can't actually produce in their notebook what is on the blackboard. So to prevent them from having a copy of notes makes no sense. And I was working at NYU for a while. NYU, the medical students, they go to class, they have a note taker for the class. After the class is over and they've been listening, they could take their own notes, do whatever they want to do, but afterwards they could go to the window and pick up the copy of their notes. Makes sense. It's a great idea. Some people learn by writing notes, but some people can't keep up with that pace. In terms of learning and memory, we could see kids who could perform well in many different areas, but they struggle with mastering some of the content in class. And so they still might have a learning disability or a learning difficulty because they can't actually master verbal information that they're listening to. Could be a sign of some language problems. Or they can't master visual spatial information. Could be a sign of some nonverbal learning problems. But we want to look at those areas when we're thinking about it, because sometimes that's the indication that there are real problems in a child's functioning. Attention plays a role in that, right? If you can't focus, sometimes it's hard to remember the things that you're just looking at or hearing. Executive function's a broad area of skill sets, but they really have to do with output of capacity. So they're not as much in learning disabilities, which is about how do you integrate or input information. They're much more about what do you do with that information. How well can you inhibit distractions, control your behavior to stay online and on target with things? How do you use working memory to keep information in mind and enhance the likelihood that you'll remember that information for a later point in time? How do you think flexibly about solving problems? Kids who have these weaknesses tend to get stuck on things and they just keep repeating the same ineffective approach many times. They're sort of hard to get off. And then how do you manage sort of motivation and emotional regulation? I will tell you, in terms of this area, I have not met a child, regardless of what teachers, parents, or children tell me, I have not met a child who's lazy. There's no such thing. They tell me that they're lazy, and then I convince them that they're not lazy. Parents are a little harder to convince once they've decided that their child is lazy. Teachers might be too. The issue is that kids who struggle and look to be lazy are often being judged as having weaknesses in these areas. And the weaknesses, executive functions, tend to be that they have a hard time getting started on things, a hard time persisting through things, and therefore a hard time finishing things. The last component, they may work to a certain point and then realize they run out of steam. And so they don't want to go back and check their work to see how accurately what they did met with the results that they were trying to achieve. So those are executive functioning skill sets. The examples that I give are kids who say, no, I'm lazy. I know I'm lazy because I go home and I watch TV when I know I should be writing the paper. I was like, oh, really? Okay, tell me what that's like. Well, I'm sitting on the couch and then my mom comes home and she says, aren't you supposed to be doing your paper? And I say, yes, I was trying to get up to do it. So, but you were lazy in that moment. Yes. Or procrastinating. I'm not sure about procrastination. I still don't. I'm very dubious about it. The laziness I know doesn't exist. I say, well, tell me what you were thinking about while you were watching TV. What was the show you were watching and what was going on? Well, it's hard to remember. Do you remember what you're thinking? Yeah, I was thinking I need to get up and start writing my paper. Oh yeah? How often were you thinking about that? I kept thinking to myself, I need to get up and start writing. What's wrong with me? Why am I not getting up and starting to write? If I don't get up and start writing, I'm not going to be able to get to it later on. So these kids spend most of their time looking from the outside like they're being lazy, but they're actually probably engaged in the activity of trying to go through their mind to rally up enough effort to get started on something, and they're finding that to be unbearable. So for me, it's a sign of some executive functioning weaknesses rather than a sign of laziness. Procrastination maybe is about betting in some ways, which is another sort of executive functioning, knowing you have to start at a certain point in order to do the best job that's possible. And the kids who struggle with this, they all make all these sort of assumptions about themselves that tend to be accurate as well. Like they say, I really work best at night. Well, nobody works best at night, honestly. I work best at the last minute. No, that's not true. Nobody works best at the last minute. There's no person in this room or on earth who works best at the very last minute. I have to be panicked to get my best performance. No, that's not true either. They're struggling with executive functions. And this can be very hard to kind of counteract and to deal with. But we want to evaluate that because that could be behind the scenes as affecting things. We certainly want to know about how kids are feeling, and as their emotions will impact how they're performing in a school. So we want to look at those areas. And sometimes kids don't directly say things. They'll tell you that they're happy when in fact everybody thinks that they're struggling in some ways with emotion. So sometimes we use these sort of projective measures to make sense of that. We ask typically parents to report about what they see in terms of behaviors, teachers to report on terms of what they say about behaviors, and children themselves to report about what they see about behaviors. In terms of components of an evaluation, we want to look at the difference between potential and achievement. So what is it, how capable is a child and how well are they performing? We want to think in a school room, I said this I guess before, but in an education in a school evaluation in a school district, they're not going to make a clinical diagnosis. When I do evaluations, that's what I'm trying to come up with, a clinical diagnosis, because a diagnosis dictates what are the interventions that are supposed to be provided to the child to help them improve, and what should be done by those around people to help the child sort of function better. What are the accommodations that they're entitled to? So you might have from a psychoeducational evaluation, fewer recommendations. They might not be as comprehensive as we want to see, and they're not including all these areas. So some kids just need more testing to be done in order to make sense of them, and you can ask your school districts to do that as well, though it costs money, so they might not always be inclined to agree with you. Commuting with the school is a good idea, right? Nice soft start, be friendly, collaborate on common goals, meet with the teacher, meet with the principal, discuss ways to help the child, ask them about referrals for an evaluation, ask them to add things to the evaluation that should be done. You want to request your evaluation in writing to the school district. because you want to make sure that there's a record of when you ask them to do this. It could be requested by a parent, a guardian, a teacher, and has to be submitted to either the principal or the special education head. In terms of evaluation referral, that could be through the Board of Education or Department of Education to the school district, but you have these sort of different age ranges where you might think about evaluations as being done in a different way: early intervention, committee for preschool education, and committee for special education. The school may not assess a child for special education without written consent from parents. So you should know when they're going to evaluate your child. 9 o'clock at night, not the best time. I've seen that happen. In unfavorable settings, not the best time. When the child's being pulled out from a final that they're supposed to take and they're clamoring that they're going to miss the chance to do their final, probably not a good time to do an evaluation. They have to provide a written assessment plan explaining what tests are going to be given. That would be your opportunity to say, could you add these tests, because we think they would be helpful. And the evaluators have to be specialized to do the assessments. They have to be performed in a reasonable number of days. I don't want to tell you what days they are because it might vary from your school district to another school district, but these are business school days, or days that schools are in session. So I know I notice a lot of days off on my child's calendar, but they have to complete the evaluation a certain amount of time. The recommendations also have to be implemented within a reasonable number of time. I know this varies for districts because sometimes child gets occupational therapy, but then there's no occupational therapist working in the district, and so it delays the time frame. These are things to kind of keep pushing for to get the services your child needs. And they should come at no cost to the parent. I just want to highlight a couple things about sort of intervention strategies. We're trying to think about what are the things that need to be done. The first purpose of the evaluation is to demystify things. We don't want people wondering, I don't really know what's going on with the child. If they have a reading disorder, let's identify it as a reading disorder so that we can name it and then provide the services that need to be done. So we want to take out the role of confusion here. There's sometimes where an evaluation I think that I've completed is very clear, and we present it to the school district and they say, let's keep thinking about what's going on, because we see these results, but we don't really know what's happening. I don't understand that. Like, the evaluation should give you answers and point you in the right direction of what's going on. And oftentimes they do. So sometimes people continue to speculate and try to drum up different ideas of what's going on. It's certainly the case that kids who have reading disorders could be demoralized. So how they feel about their reading could influence their performance, but the dyslexia is the problem. The reading is the problem, not how they feel about it. We want to correct the problem so that then they can feel good about what they're doing. Gives us a shared vocabulary, though, if we're using the same terms. Lets the adults know that they could be helpful. Lets the kids know that adults can be helpful and have a plan to help them to continue to be productive. We want to minimize things that lead to humiliation. Reading out loud in the classroom clearly is something that's uncomfortable for a child who has a reading disorder. They don't want to do it, so let's not make them do it. And there might be other things. Let's say a child who has some disruptive behavior in the classroom or is acting impulsively. If the teachers are having to say, Justin, please go back to your desk, and then the kids start saying, Justin, the teacher just said this, that's humiliating. That's demoralizing. So having a behavior plan put in place that sort of minimizes those moments would be a good idea. Not all behavior plans work equally well, but trying to minimize opportunities to feel humiliated or bad in school is a good goal. We want to know what the strengths are because we want to strengthen those strengths so that the child can function the best. So every child is unique. Everybody has their own constellation of things that they're good at and things that they struggle with. So sort of identifying what those are and trying to build upon them would be good. It also helps a child get some positive feedback even when they're performing poorly in other areas. So noticing those small things that are going on well is something to highlight for a child instead of just kind of harping on the things that are not working well. There's a set of compensatory strategies. So these are sort of like accommodations. Reduce the amount of work product, giving extended time on tests, using a tape recorder if you're trying to get your ideas out for something, using books on tape, getting a foreign language waiver. These are all accommodations that are appropriate to provide a child copies of class notes, because we know we don't want to, these are not going to remediate the problem. They're not going to make something go away, but they're going to do damage control, minimize the moments of frustration for the child, and that's sort of appropriate and helpful. Remediation is something that we want to think about if we have it for all the kids. There's a wide range in our field of of different people providing different interventions. Some have been tested to show that they're worthwhile. That's not to say that others are not worthwhile, but we know that some people are providing services to address problems that are not really the child's central issue. So we sort of want to be informed about what are the choices that you have available to you, but we want to look for remediation. In terms of learning disabilities, multi-sensory methods of instruction, there's some learning strategies approaches that work well. These are just for dyslexia. I've thrown a few up there, but Linda Mood Bell has a few other kind of programs for mathematics thinking. These are tested and shown to be effective for some kids. It doesn't mean that's going to be the only thing that works, but having a program of remediation as opposed to having a homework helper have the child get the work done, that's probably the direction you want to go to. More tried and true interventions. There's a website, What Works Clearinghouse. It's a pretty good website because it lists all of the not all of, but many of the supportive services that are being provided to people, and highlights how they're effective and what ones are effective for. So What Works Clearinghouse. It's worth looking at. You just want to know your rights. You have a right to pre-evaluation conference. You have a right to have a copy of a report before a team meeting. Sometimes you have the team meeting and the people give you the report then, and you're like, I didn't have a chance to even read this or understand what was found or what was said. You deserve a copy of all the evaluations that have been done. The school must evaluate all areas of suspected disability. You have the right to request a functional behavior assessment at any point. So if your child's showing that they're having some problems in how they're acting in the classroom, then you can ask for this, because it'll look at what was the behavior, but what happened before the behavior occurred, to try to identify what the triggers are. And parents are always members of a child's decision team, right? You can't have a meeting without a parent being present. In terms of the IEP, typically a social worker, psychologists, and other team members are going to be included in that. It could include the teachers, might include the principal, should include you, should include a parent advocate. The evaluation results must be provided to you so that you can use them and think about them. If the child is found eligible for services, then the child's classified into one of those categories, and the committee will develop an IEP plan. They might suggest that you do a 504 plan, which is sort of like getting the accommodations but not the remediation. Sometimes that's appropriate for your child. Sometimes you feel like your child's missing out on something that they really need as a remedial service. So you don't have to settle for one over the other if you think that more needs to be done. And if they're found ineligible, they might get a 504 plan. It doesn't guarantee an IEP. It's not as extensive, but it might cover extracurricular and other school programming. We're trying to think that the results of evaluations are highlighting for us what is the norm and how is a child performing compared to their peers. We want to apply some statistics for how we evaluate those things. So I just mentioned that because they're sort of important ways of understanding the results of the evaluation. Not so much the percentile rank, but the percentile ranks might be meaningful for you. So if your child's performing at the second percentile, it doesn't mean they'll always perform at the second percentile in a certain area of functioning, but it's an indication, a red flag, that there's an area of weakness here. So you just want to think about this number line. Most people, 50% of the population, is going to be from 25th to 75th percentile on a line. But the kids that I end up evaluating, doing neuropsych tests on an evaluation, probably 90% of them, if not 95% of them, scores on the different measures that I give range from the first percentile to the 99th percentile. I mean, that's like crazy, right? I don't mean crazy in a bad way. I mean that it's like remarkable. It's truly amazing. Meaning that they have amazing areas of strength and potential and areas of weakness. If you disagree with an IEP or with the meeting, the results of the meeting, you can ask for an evaluation to be done. You don't have to agree to anything that they're asking you to do, so you don't have to sign off on the IEP that they've provided for you. You have the right to go through the process of reviewing and considering other options for your child, so you're not really obligated to accept them. Even if the person says, oh, well, go ahead and just sign it, you don't have to if you don't agree. You might choose to have an independent evaluator come in and do an evaluation. So if the school district has done theirs, then you might want to have someone come and evaluate your child separately so that they come up with a broader set of conclusions about what needs to be done. Or maybe they'll agree with the school and say that what the school is suggesting is appropriate. There are different people that you can get this from, like a pediatrician might have ideas of other evaluators who could do things. You want someone who is not just a trainee to be overseeing the evaluation process if you're getting an independent evaluator, right? You want someone, a trainee might be fine to do the test, but you want someone who has knowledge and has been experienced in this field to examine the results and make sense of them so they can come up with the best conclusion. And you want someone who's willing to meet with the school team to talk about the results and try to advocate for your child. And that's it. Did I give us enough time for a few questions? You had to raise your hand, yeah.
Good question. So if a child has dyslexia, how do you segregate out when their writing and their mathematical skills are also performing poorly, whether or not they also have a writing learning disability and a math disability, or is it just an overpouring of the dyslexia?
So it's a good question. So I don't know if I would worry myself too much about that at a certain point. So early on, the first thing kids are learning to do is learning to read. So from, let's say, kindergarten to 3rd grade, I want to see that those skills are coming along nicely. Writing sort of happens at a much earlier age now than it did when I was younger, right? I don't think I was asked to do a lot of writing in kindergarten or 1st grade, but we're asking kids now to do these small moments. So if they make a lot of errors in how they're writing, but they understand that writing is a way to communicate ideas, I'm not as concerned about the spelling problems there, let's say, in those early grades. Yeah, so 4th grade is, 3rd and 4th grade are a shifting point from kids having to learn the foundation skill sets to having to learn how to apply them much more and more. The rule of thumb is sort of like 1st through 3rd, let's say, is learning to read. 4th grade on is reading to learn. So they have to have mastered sort of as much as possible the skills for reading to do well 4th grade on. If a child's struggling with writing, 4th grade's a reasonable time to be concerned about that. And they just might have more than one learning disability. They're probably coming from the same source, right? So if I'm talking like a neuropsychologist, reading comes from these parts of the brain. If they're having writing problems, a kid who has reading problems, it's probably like some areas are sort of impacting their written performance. They might meet criteria for 2 diagnoses, but they have a learning disabilities profile. It's amazing that some kids who have reading problems, like those decoding problems, don't have problems with comprehension, and sometimes don't have problems with written output. It's amazing. It's not likely. It's amazing. And they just might not perform so badly in terms of writing that you would want to call it a diagnosis. So think of degree of impairment, right? So if you look at someone's writing and they can't form complete sentences at 4th grade, can't use sentences to convey ideas in sentences into paragraphs, that's probably a sign that they're struggling with writing more profoundly than needs be. If kids have problems with like basic math facts and retrieval, but don't have problems understanding word problems, that might be a signal that you don't have to worry too much about mathematics, because the weakness is probably tied to a retrieval problem. So that these brain areas that are involved in retrieving the sounds and words and being able to manipulate them can lead to other retrieval problems. So if you go to the grocery store and you see everybody on your block and your child is like, who was that? I can't remember their name. I can't remember their name. That's just a retrieval problem that has led to some of the struggles with dyslexia. It also is leading to a problem with basic math fact recall and name recall and those kind of things. So I would worry less about that. The kids who have meaningful math problems, sometimes who have math disorders but don't have reading and writing disorders, they tend to show problems with just conceptual math thinking. They don't seem to understand the value of numbers on a number line. So you say, I had a young 9th grader who I said, she saw something and said, if you write the number of grains of sand on a beach on the Dead Sea and you mail it to us, you'll get $1 million. And she was like, I'm gonna do this. And I was like, really? Like, how many grains of sand are on the beach in the Dead Sea? She was like, I think I'll Google it. And I was like, I don't think so. So that sort of proportional thinking. Or if you say, if you have 10, this is maybe, let's say, 3rd and 4th up. If you say like 10 minus 5, how many? And they say 11. You know, they're just off in terms of proportionality. That's a signal of more significant math problems and math thinking. Probably you'll see it in other walks of life for a child. Yeah. Yeah, you were, and then I'll come in front here. Yeah.
Can you speak to testing when doing the neuropsych testing and issues of attention and deciphering how much of that is auditory processing affecting really, it's not really attention, it's just their processing?
Yeah, so there's debates. Partly there could be like lots of interesting theoretical debates or debates among professionals. Auditory processing is probably a signal of some weaknesses around hearing the sounds and words and being able to play and manipulate with them. It's described sometimes as in a category separate from other categories, and sometimes we see kids who do use words in funny ways, and you think like, the switch there, these connections between words and sounds and words is a little bit funny, so that when you expect the switch to be thrown a certain way, it's like the switch doesn't get thrown and another switch gets thrown in the brain. So the group of kids who are described as having auditory processing problems could show some of the same problems with attentional control. Meaning that they're distracted in class or they have a hard time discriminating sounds. They might be listening to the sound in the distance but not listening to the sound in the foreground. So I hear that fan blowing. I don't know if anybody else hears that fan blowing. It seems like hard to habituate to. Yeah, people over there for sure. It's pouring right on them. But people who have attentional problems also describe some of that problems with habituating to sounds or stimuli in their environment. So I, have a family who came in, their child has ADHD. I'm pretty sure the father has ADHD. He was walking down the hallway. He's like, these lights are so funny. They are so bright. They just throw the light and the shadows in a certain way, and it really affects me. So they're very sensitive to some environmental stimuli, and they can't kind of habituate to it. It's like the control mechanisms for attention don't lead them to drown out something that's irrelevant or should be irrelevant, whereas most other people could have that capacity. And maybe some aspects of processing the sounds could be meaningful there. There's specialists who do evaluations for auditory processing. I trust the work that they do. The tests that they use tend to be some of the same tests that we use, either in our work as evaluators or in our research. So one of the most common tests that's used is a dichotic listening test. Ask a child to listen with headphones on. They produce some sounds in this auditory field and some sounds in this auditory field, and you want them to integrate those sounds. The research literature suggests those are amazing attention measures. So it's hard for me to completely answer your question. I believe that there are some kids who have an issue called auditory processing disorder, and it leads to have an impact on probably their attention control, their ability to distinguish sounds in the environment, their ability to manage some sound processing or making sense of sounds in the world. Processing as a term is not a term that I love. It's not, I'm not commenting on the diagnosis, but processing implies our brains work like a computer. So they process stuff. They actually don't seem to do that, right? Like when you look at a word on page that you have, if you see your name somewhere on a page, you just see it and you know it's there. You didn't process it. I mean, you processed it on some level, meaning you recognized it and were aware of it on some level, and the meaning of that word came to mind. So we don't really always go through the process of processing information. We either, that information makes sense to us or doesn't make sense, and sometimes we have to apply a little more mental effort to tasks. But I believe there are some kids who are in that category. The ways that we distinguish them from kids who have attention problems is not very easy. If you sent me an email, I could send you an article on the differential diagnosis because it's meaningful, though it may not be so cut and dry that this is clearly one condition versus another. And if it is, we don't have all the tools to do that effectively, to distinguish always which it is.
A couple questions on relating to the school.
Yeah.
You talked about the differential diagnosis between IQ and achievement.
Yeah.
And you had to rule out that it wasn't a teaching issue.
Yeah.
How can parents approach that with the school district? It's sort of like you're not a good I mean, just without any diplomacy, it's kind of like.
You're a bad teacher. Oh yeah.
So that's the first one. And the second one is I've noticed a lot of resistance to do the functional behavior analysis. They really dodge that one. And I'm wondering why, and my sense is because it could expose something that they don't want you to know about, like bad teaching or something, or an inappropriate setting or something like that.
Yeah.
So could you talk about those
Yeah.
from the school perspective?
Yeah.
Why we're getting
Yeah.
pushback and how to deal with it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I listen to everything everyone says with a grain of salt. So if I don't always know if people are being as straightforward in those conversations as they could be. So that, I think, is partly behind your question. In terms of reading instruction, most kids who don't have a reading disorder are going to learn to read from the basic classroom intervention and the support you provide at home. And they're going to pick up on it adequately. So my 7-year-old is in the 1st grade. She's doing pretty good in terms of her reading. My 4-year-old is occasionally watching her read because we're talking about words. He's starting to pick up on them automatically. He's way ahead of the instruction he's going to actually get. But it's a signal for me that lots of kids sometimes just pick up on reading fine. They have to be taught to read. There's almost no kids that learn to read automatically. Maybe some of the kids who are described as hyperlexic, who learn to read when they're like 2 or 3, somehow are masters in pattern analysis. So they look at information, they figure out how to decode them quickly and automatically. Those kids do often sometimes struggle with comprehension, so that they're sort of masters at mechanical processes without really understanding the meaning of them. But most of classroom instruction is going to be adequate for most kids' needs. So if a child's underperforming in terms of reading, I don't think as a teacher, I mean as a parent, you can't really evaluate if the teaching is effective enough. But I would say as a rule of thumb, it's probably effective enough for like more than 80% of the class.
Well, it's more like
So,
an auditory processing kid with an auditory processing problem who's just getting auditory instruction.
he's just getting a lot of verbal instruction and
Yeah,
not
without
multisensory instruction.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, it would be where you would say the child needs more instruction. So they have, in lots of schools, all these reading recovery programs. So that's sort of the next step, that they might get some reading recovery, and then they get that. Maybe that will help them enough. Maybe if it doesn't, then they need more. And then FBA, I think it's just that, I mean, my sense is that lots of districts don't have someone in district to do the FBA, so they have to hire someone to do it. It's not easy to find credentialed people to do it for the school district, so it's about ease of accessibility. Could be about money. I don't really know. And so, but you know, some districts are large enough that they have a behavioral specialist that comes in, and then the question will be, do you agree with the findings of that person? But I think probably by and large they're mostly trying to push back or just say that's not necessary because they don't want to, they don't have ease of access to someone who could do it, or they don't have dollars that they want to devote to that. It's not a good reason to not provide it, but.
He's not severe enough because the FBA is usually considered for the real problem students, whereas I think it could also really apply to an inattentive kid and why. Yeah.
No doubt. I mean, that argument, sorry for me, just doesn't make any sense. You know, you have to be severe in order to get something that would be helpful. And I also think the teacher wouldn't probably agree either, because lots of teachers spend lots of time in the classroom managing behavior rather than teaching. So for them, any tools that might help them manage classroom behavior better for the severe and less severe kids would be helpful for them. Yeah, you had a question, and then I'll come over here. Yeah.
Two quick questions. One
Yeah.
was, it seems like the basis of what you're describing is a different IQ perceivability, and trying to understand why that is, what you're actually measuring. If kids have learning disabilities, how do you measure IQ? That's one question. How do you actually assess that? And the second is, as schools, I've noticed that SFUSD changes programs to address like dyslexia, for example, mid-year, and what is the impact of that in your experience of these changing programs recently?
Yeah, it's totally accurate that some learning disabilities are going to present themselves as adding confounds to accurately measuring intelligence. If you have a language disorder and I ask you verbal questions that are part of a verbal IQ, they're gonna probably be harder for you to answer. So your verbal IQ is gonna go down, though that doesn't mean your IQ is really accurately measured. As evaluators, we struggle with the accuracy of our measures. And we struggle with whether our measures actually measure the things we want them to measure. So I might give a test of mathematics, and because a 4th grader didn't get 2 items, they end up performing as if they were a 3rd grader. It's only 2 questions that I gave them. So it's not that measurement is awkward, and we do the best that we can, and we have to be careful about the conclusions we make because of it. It's also true that kids who have like a nonverbal learning disorder, if I give them tests on nonverbal IQ tests, they're very challenging for them. So they could end up performing in the 1st percentile, whereas their verbal IQ could be well above average. Those mismatches are signals of a learning disability, though not conclusive of a learning disability. But that's why every time you meet with an evaluator and the evaluator says, your child's IQ score is this, they should also say, we don't know where it's going to be later on after we provide remediation. I've seen IQ scores rise with proper remediation. It's just, we measure error as well. How well we can account for that is sometimes limited. Changing programs midstream, I guess if they change from a bad program to a good program, hoorah! But you don't know why. And unless they could articulate to you why they changed programs and what impact it would have on your child, I'd probably not have them do that. Lots of the reading instruction tends to be quite similar. So I listed a number of different choices, but those were all mostly phonological, multisensory instruction models. So how the kid might not even notice that they changed programs, or you might not either. And so from one to another, it might be like apples to apples, and Granny Smith tastes as good as the other one, but if they're switching for a program that doesn't work, then that's fine. There's like a program that I've seen kids, not as much lately, but some programs we would look at the What Works Clearinghouse and say, this is rated as an ineffective program. Our research studies have shown us this doesn't work. And school districts might still be providing it, though the one I'm thinking of, I haven't seen it lately. But the school district says, this is the program we're providing to help with these remediation. So if they change from that program to another one, I would be really happy. Because, the parent could just go in and say, I have 3 research articles that say this doesn't work. Could we change this program? If they changed from day 1 to day 2, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're going to ask a question then over here, and then I think we should probably stop.
So my question is also related to IQ. A lot of what we see in schools is driven by the IQ. So how can I easily look at a profile and determine for a child that's, say, borderline ID, SLD, that is truly an ID profile? Am I not going to see scatter in the, say they're giving the WISC, as opposed to if it's SLD, is there going to be a lot of scatter? How can I easily distinguish? Because that IQ is what drives so many of the battles that we have in the district.
So ID is really a diagnosis that should be based on IQ measures. They have their limitations, right? They're also not
ID mean?
intellectual disability. So it could be. So the IQ measure has its own limitations. We talked about the potential of error. If a kid has a language problem, then they're going to underperform on that test. So that has to be done thoughtfully. I think it requires clinical thinking and decision making, not focus simply on the scores.
Does that cognitive assessment matter at all, if it's the WISC or the Stanford?
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah, it could still tell you a lot of information, but some of the information it might tell you is we're measuring the condition of language impairment, not just intellectual capacity. There are ways to get around that. Sometimes on on one of our IQ tests, we have recognition measures. So we ask a child, tell me the names of these, tell me the words, tell me what these words mean. We give them that test. Well, then we can also go back and say, tell me what these words mean. They're the same words you saw before, but now here are some choices. So a child who can't organize their thoughts to articulate what's the problem might look at the set of answers and pick the correct answer because they know the information. So we try to kind of use our tools to help provide a better assessment. Intellectual disability has to be based, and I say, there's also clearly problems with the cultural competency of our intelligence tests. So, that there's a factor that could be included to that as well. But intellectual disability has to be based on not just a low IQ score. They have to be based on also problems with adaptive functioning, being able to manage things. So a kid whose IQ score might be borderline might still be able to get up in the morning, get themselves dressed, make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, get themselves to the school bus, make sure they get to school on time, manage their materials just fine. That child probably does not have intellectual disability.
But the district says communication is one of adaptive, do you know what I mean? So they'll say, well, communication counts as an adaptive skill.
Hire a lawyer. No, I'm sorry.
It doesn't, you're saying.
There's not I mean, there's, you know, I guess, I just think it's weird sometimes how you end up getting stuck in debates about things. Like if the child needs services, let's try to provide those, and if we can make a good argument of why the services make sense, let's try to use some common sense. I understand why that doesn't always happen, and sometimes you need big guns to help advocate for your child. There's no offense to any one particular person, but parents have an input on what's going on. I don't share any information with a parent that a parent doesn't already know. I give it a label, I talk about how it might impact things, I talk about what to try to do to help with it, but I tell parents about the children that they have in their house. They know what their child's struggling with. So some of these debates, I mean, it sounds complicated in the example you're given because if there's significant language impairments, intellectual capacity will be limited, a capacity to manage tasks outside will be limited in some ways, but they shouldn't be limited across the board. So if it's not intellectual disability and language impairment, then we should sort of flesh that out and make it clear. And still, what I end up finding for kids who have significant language impairment and their IQ scores are significantly reduced because of the language impairment, they need lots of language therapy, and sometimes a specialized school setting. Because what ends up happening is the kids get 2 times 30 minutes of language therapy. If you have a language impairment, what is that going to do for you? You're missing, like, there's so much more of the day that's going on where people are talking, and you can't keep up. So, like, you know, they just need lots more language intervention. So that in those cases, I'm sometimes saying they need 5 times a week language intervention. And the school district said, well, we don't give 5 times a week. Why? Then I'd be looking at specialized schools. And then you need a lawyer. I mean, your district is not likely going to say to you, we like having this debate with you, so let's instead, you find a specialized school and let's pay for you to send the child to the specialized school. They're not going to say that. So you probably need someone who can help advocate for you.
Look at the IQ and that drives, you know, what they think the child is.
I'm not trying to be overly dismissive, but this is, you got to iron out some of these problems with thinking, and you need someone who can interpret the results in a sensible way, because you're struggling to make sense of what doesn't make sense to you, right? So when you feel like you're being, I mean, I've had families that say, I go to the meeting, the teacher is providing 40 different accommodations to this individual child. Changing the tone of their voice when they talk to them, giving them taps and reminder on the shoulder. They're doing, like, literally a list of 40 things the teacher's doing. And the district says, well, his needs are being met in the classroom. There's no sign of educational impairment. I don't know how that makes sense. So when it doesn't make sense, sometimes you just have to say, it doesn't make sense. And you know, parents, I feel emotional in some of these conversations. There's no doubt that parents have to get emotional, but it's not, it feels personal, and yet it might not be. Thank you guys for your great audience. Thanks so much.